Welcome to Tigrai Media House. My name is Maliti Burhanamaskal. After 9 days of negotiating in South Africa, the government of Ethiopia and the government of Tigray ended with an 8-page document entitled The Agreement for Lasting Peace. It's an 8-page document, 9 pages if you include the cover. All the pages are initialed. You have 5 initials on each page. And on the last page, you have 6 signatures. There are 15 articles. And unfortunately, less than 24 hours after signing this agreement, 3 towns in Tigray were hit in airstrikes, even though the Ethiopian government agreed not to do so in Article 3, Number 2 of the agreement. Today, we have Martin Plaut with us, a Horn of Africa analyst, someone who has provided poignant and timely analysis on what's happening in the Horn of Africa. Thank you so much for being with us today, Martin.
It's a pleasure.
So, Martin, I'm curious what your overall view is of the process first, how it was conducted, who was involved, and then the subsequent agreement. One of the things that I heard is that Obasanjo was not particularly heavily involved, that most of the credit went to former President Kenyatta. Tell me what you thought about just the process itself and everyone who was involved.
Well, one of the things that was really interesting about the whole process was just how tightly controlled it was. It was in Pretoria. It was away from the media. There were no leaks. And I suppose that's why we were able to see progress, which sort of burst on us a bit unexpectedly. I've seen the rumors that President Obasanjo wasn't so involved and that President Kenyatta was. But is that true? Well, I haven't spoken to anybody from the team. And so it's difficult to know. And that's been one of the great frustrations of the entire process, is just how tight-lipped everybody has been, which has made understanding what has happened extremely difficult.
Let me tell you, so the negotiators on each side, because some of this is also not clear, I'm just going to read the names of the negotiators. So on the side for the government of Tigray, you had Mr. Getachew Reda, General Tzadkan Gebretensee, Ambassador Wandumu, Dr. Fisaha Haftetzion, Mr. Waldu Gebretensee, Mr. Kasa Gebre Yohannes, Mr. Asafa Abraha, 7 people, and then they had a security team as well. On negotiating for Ethiopia, you had Ambassador Redwan Hussein, you had Dr. Gideon Timotheos, you had Dr. Getachew Janber, Ambassador Hassan, Ambassador Menelik Alemu, Ambassador Mukhtar, Mr. Getahun Walaling, I don't even know who that is, Mr. Nazareth Iyob Isatu, General Teshome, Mr. Bonsa Unetu. 10 people negotiating on the side of Ethiopia. So you watched the live broadcast, the live stream that came during the signing process, and there were really carefully, articulated words that were shared. There was a Q&A portion, but the two teams were not able to speak. It was the negotiating teams that responded to the reporters. I was really curious. I was watching some of the body language and how people were interacting. You could tell, for example, when Getachew and Redwan shook hands, just looking at their body, the uncomfortableness of that moment and where they were looking. What did you notice, or what stood out to you during that process as you were watching and giving us live updates?
Well, I mean, I agree with you that the whole thing was very strange and very tense. It was not, usually in these negotiations, if you've had, 9-10 days of working with each other, then the one thing you can be sure of is that people get to know each other a bit there. After a while, they go and have a beer together and, things relax a bit. Clearly, that hadn't happened. And why it didn't work, I don't know. The one group that was in a sense absent were the Americans. And there's been a lot of suggestions that Mike Hammer, the American special envoy, played a big role in all of this, and that it wouldn't have happened without the Americans really putting their muscle behind the issue. The Europeans may have done something as well, but the whole thing has been portrayed as if it's purely an African Union event. And Obasanjo was keen to say, "Oh, this is African solutions to African problems." That dreary old dirge that is trotted out at every conceivable moment. The other thing that, of course, absolutely strikes you immediately. You introduced this as this negotiation between the government of Ethiopia and the government of Tigray. No way. That's not what happened. You look at the document, it says between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And the fact that the Tigrayan side allowed themselves to be described in that way, when clearly they were not. I mean, they were, the whole point about as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the whole point about the resistance that there has been is that the government held, completely legitimate elections. I think it was in September 2020. You can quibble about exactly how it was done, but it was certainly as good, probably downside better than the subsequent one that took place in Ethiopia. And after that came a government, which was the TPLF won the elections, but hey, that it happens everywhere. So this was a genuine government that was there. And that they have also been supported by all the minority parties, and that the Tigray Defense Forces represents far more than just the TPLF. It represents, as I understand it, genuinely the people of Tigray. All those that could conceivably fight went to fight because they knew the alternative was death or worse.
I think that's a really great point. The agreement is quite literally between, and I'm looking right at it, the signed agreement, and it's literally between the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. This shocked a number of people when there was a draft agreement that was circulating and everyone kept saying it's a draft. But the signed agreement is fairly similar, if not identical to that draft agreement.
I can't see any differences.
I don't
think
see any
it's the same document, and the signatures on it, as far as I know, nobody said that it's a fake. Therefore, I think we have to assume that is what was signed. And, there's been not a dicky bird. There's been absolutely no explanation of what happened frankly, to the people of Tigray. I mean, who cares about the rest of the world? Who cares about whether I know it? But, the people of Tigray have the right to be told what is going on, and I just don't understand it.
So how problematic is it then that this is an agreement with the TPLF and not with the government of Tigray? First of all, the TPLF doesn't command, an army. This is an army that works for the government of Tigray. That's one thing. They talk a lot about TPLF combatants. I think you'd be hard pressed if you were on the ground in Tigray that any of these soldiers, they're not even soldiers. They're individuals who had no choice but to take up arms. I don't believe they would describe themselves as TPLF combatants. I think that's a big reach. The other thing is you have people who are on the negotiating team, and that's why I was reading the names, who have said they were never a part of TPLF. General Tzadkan, for one, was not a part of TPLF. So it's an interesting way to word this. And then I wonder how much weight does it carry if your agreement is with a political party and not the actual government?
Well, those are very good points, and it's hard to know. But I mean, I assume one has to look. I think you have to understand this document on why did it come about in the first place, and if let's look at both sides. Why did the Ethiopians come to the negotiating table? And for my money, they came to the negotiating table for two reasons. The first one was that the TDF prevented the collapse of the forces at the disposal of the Tigrayan government. They were successful enough through ambushes, through conventional warfare, to hold back the Eritrean and the Ethiopian forces, particularly along the B30. When they tried to go south and capture Mekelle, they were unable to do so. So Mekelle remained in the hands of the government, and that in a sense indicated, of course, a strength from the Ethiopian and the Eritrean side, because they were able to get that far, but still a weakness because they were losing huge numbers of troops. I'm sure there were terrible losses on both sides, and I think we really have to be sorry for everybody who has died, whoever they were. But that was, in a sense, not a position of great strength. Even more serious is the economic position of the Ethiopian government, which is down to, as I understand it, less than a month's worth of foreign exchange. They have paid hugely for those Turkish drones and the other military equipment that they have, for the collapse of the exports because of the AGOA agreement, which was the Americans cancelled, which cost them a lot of jobs in the textile industry and the rest of it. So they have really been struggling to pay for this war, which is exceptionally expensive. So, that was the weakness on the Ethiopian side. On the Eritrean side, weakness, President Isaias doesn't give a damn whether they're weak or strong. He'll send people to go and die on any battlefield that he fancies. And if they complain, you just shoot them where they are. I mean, it's the most brutal regime. I mean, one in which pity and mercy have no hold whatsoever. From the Tigrayan point of view, yes, there is equally weakness because they were unable to hold the Eritrean and the Ethiopian advance either in the southwest or in the west. Yes, I mean, I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm just, saying you can see the advances that there were. They held them in the southeast and they held them in the north, but not in those other areas. Now, was that a strategic retreat? Was it a design to do it? Was it, I've not a clue. Nobody's explained it to me, and I'm not a military expert.
Right.
But I can see what's going on. Also, you have, as you pointed out, the appalling suffering of the people because of the blockade, which has gone on essentially for 2 years, and where you can't supply people with any drugs almost at all, even in Mekelle, in the hospitals. Where surgeons are having to wring out and re-wash the bandages and the surgical. I mean, it's just appalling. When you hear those stories, you have to be heartbroken. Who would not want to get an agreement? Everybody surely would want to save the lives of people and to try to stop the immense suffering that is going on. If that happens, everybody surely should rejoice. But so far we have seen nothing. I mean, this is day one of this agreement. Where is the United Nations UNHAS flight into Mekelle with those urgent drugs?
Right. Well, and I think you bring up a good point. The Tigrayan team really had their back up against a wall. I mean, the same day that this agreement was released, or maybe it was the day before, there was a doctor out of Eider who said they're losing 12 patients a day from lack of insulin. This is in a major hospital. Forget about what's happening in the countrysides or in other towns where the hospitals are completely destroyed. 12 patients a day. And that doesn't even take into account the hunger issue, people who were dying of starvation. So there was a desperation of just getting services and food and basic necessities to the people in Tigray. But what's tragic about that, because to me, and I'm curious what you think that Tigrayans gained in this agreement, if anything, but to me, it looks like the Ethiopian government successfully used aid as a weapon and successfully used weaponized aid as a way to achieve a political outcome. That's what it looks like on the surface, because I've read this document several times and I can't understand what the Tigrayans gained from it. So what do you think? Was there anything else you feel like that they gained? I know that a cessation of hostilities was one of the items here, but 3 towns were bombed this morning. So what did the average Tigrayan gain?
Well, let's be optimistic. Let's assume that after a short period that actually some kind of end of hostilities does take place. I mean, it usually takes a couple of days of stuttering conflict before these things bed in. So maybe this will happen. If we want to be positive, we could always also point out that in the last war that Ethiopia and Eritrea fought back in 1998 to 2000, there was a cessation of hostilities agreement in June, and it was only a full peace agreement in December. So maybe this is just first step, and that was what President Obasanjo said. He said, this is just the first step, and there will be others. So, if we want to be optimistic, we can see this is just a first step, and perhaps in a couple of days, the aid convoys from the World Food Programme and the others and the flights will go in, and the situation on the ground will improve for ordinary men and women. The other thing, and this is rather one of the most peculiar things about this, is there is a joint statement and there's a draft agreement, or the agreement, which you pointed to. There are two things which were signed. In the joint statement, point 4 says, "It is fundamental that we reaffirm our commitment to safeguarding the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ethiopia and to upholding the Constitution of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia." Now, if that is the case, then as I understand it, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer, and I'm sure you know these things a lot better than I do, that would mean inside in the Constitution, there's a definition of what Tigray is. There's certainly implied is Tigray includes the Western Tigray all the way up to Sudan. If that is the case, then that is again, because it would suggest that, in a sense, the authorities in Mekelle will now have authority all the way up to Sudan in that area of Western Tigray, where people, I don't know, what is it, 800,000 people were forced to flee before the offensive, particularly by the Amhara forces. And what's going to happen to there's something like 200,000 Amhara who've gone to live in those homes now. I've no idea. But that's could be one issue. The other issue, if you look at the Constitution, you remember Article 39 includes the right to secede. Uh-huh. Is that really on the cards? Is that really an option? I'm not trying to tell you that it is, but if this agreement upholds the Constitution of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, and it has to be the Constitution as it was at the moment that this agreement was signed, not some constitution as it is then subsequently altered, which of course could happen. But this agreement relates to the constitution as it was then. It can't be a future constitution. Then both of those things, in my view, seem to be to apply. But I'd be interested in your view.
I think that's an excellent takeaway from this. So you're right. It refers to going back and upholding the current constitution. There's a few issues with that. Well, first of all, let me say this. It's very cryptic what the Ethiopian government is required to do related to the Eritreans. It's very cryptic in terms of IDPs and Western Tigray. You have to sort of infer from what's written there. So if you go back to the Constitution, then you're absolutely right. It says, related to the nation states, if there's a dispute on territory, the two states have to come to an agreement. And if they can't come to an agreement, the House of Federation gets to determine it based on settlement patterns and things. So this is also a House of Federation that supported the law enforcement order on Tigray. So that doesn't bode well for the people of Tigray. So even though some analysts are calling that a win, that it's referring to the Constitution, I don't see it that way in terms of how that could all unfold. And also the resettlement of IDPs back to where they back home, basically, that's going to be an interesting process as well, because like you said, 200,000 Amhara have been settled in Western Tigray. So how will that look? There are no details. The details are sparse. There's also no time frame or timeline attached to that. It says something like, as security on the ground, or as things allow on the ground, that this will take place. I want to call that out too, because there are timetables and deliverables for the TPLF, but there aren't. The same thing doesn't exist for what the Ethiopian government is supposed to do, including restoration of services. It says that they'll be restored, but it doesn't say, is that going to happen tomorrow or in 5 days or in 30 days? It says immediate humanitarian access, but that hasn't happened, at least not that I know of. We've been watching closely, and that still hasn't occurred. So the other thing it says that I think is really interesting, it says that Tigray should have representation now in the federal government. what do you make of that? Because does that mean the current leadership of Tigray, like you said, there was an election. These individuals were elected by the people of Tigray. Are those the same individuals who you had called terrorists? Which, by the way, one of the agreements was to remove TPLF designation as terrorists, which I think is a big blow to the whole reason they went to war. This was a completely unnecessary war. If now you've changed your mind and you don't deem them terrorists. But back to my question, who then is joining this federal government then? And does that mean that now the TPLF is going to be a part of the Prosperity Party? I mean, what does this all look like? I mean, how do you unwind all of this?
Well, I wish I knew, and I'm sure that nobody who isn't in on the negotiations, even people who are in the negotiations, may be confused, because these are the kind of issues that would have been fought over backwards and forwards over many days and probably late into the night. So I don't know how this will develop. I mean, the other question was that there was a suggestion there was going to be an interim administration put in place. And it seemed as if this was going to be an interim administration put in place by the federal government, and with no reference to the current administration. Well, then what's supposed to happen to the current government of Tigray? I mean, that seemed to me to be very strange. But I find it difficult to interpret these things. I mean, the other question which you mentioned is the question of Eritrea, and I don't know if you want to deal with that separately, but or do you want to deal with it now?
No, let's talk about Eritrea, because that is the elephant in the room, and
Absolutely.
and Ethiopia is clearly intimidated and won't name names when it talks about Eritrea in this document. It just says foreign forces, and it says that the national defense forces will be on all of the borders to protect, incursions from happening from either side of the border. Well, you mean from Eritrea is what you mean when you say that. So, but they won't name them directly. So how do you, and by the way, you and I both know, and so many others, that the Eritrean trolls are very strong be it on social media or in other environments, and they've been relatively silent. I think now you're starting to hear folks come out. These are pro-Isaias, pro-Eritrea individuals who just harass people online. But what are your thoughts on Eritrea and perhaps what Isaias is thinking right now? Because let's be honest, even though a lot of issues with this agreement, it doesn't bode well for Isaias. That's for sure.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I genuinely don't know. When I say I don't know, it means that I really don't know. I'm not trying to just be skeptical of what you're saying. I mean, the only element of this that really seems to directly relate to the Eritreans is Article 3, subsection 2, which is this permanent cessation of all forms of hostility shall include, among others, then goes through various things, the use of proxies to destabilize other parties or collusion with any external force hostile to either party. So you could see that as the Eritreans. I mean, they're obvious. I suppose you could argue maybe that the Sudanese could be included in there. Maybe that's why it's worded the way it is. I mean, this is not worded by accident. And I presume this was pushback from the Ethiopian side saying, well, we don't want to name them because although Prime Minister Abiy has accepted that they are there, and he did, in fact, I think it was a year ago, in fact, longer, ask the Eritreans to leave, and he said so specifically after a trip to Asmara. They never have. In fact, it's quite the other way around. Ethiopian troops were repeatedly flown into Asmara and moved into Eritrea, and this was a joint operation. In fact, people suggested the current fighting has been directed from Asmara rather than Addis Ababa. Now, I'm not on the ground, so I can't verify that in any way. But I mean, that is what is being said repeatedly, and that's one other element of this agreement which is entirely silent. There is absolutely nothing about the rights, of the media, local and international, to report from either Ethiopia or from Eritrea. So, all of this is going to continue under a blanket of international silence, where anyone who goes in does so at huge risk. And when even the local media report on it, they get harassed. So, we aren't going to know, as far as I can tell, unless the power is switched on and all the systems are reintegrated. Then perhaps we'll get local journalists in Tigray reporting on what is going on in Tigray. But at the moment, it is, we only get the very smallest glimpses of what is happening, and certainly not from Al Jazeera, CNN, BBC, Agence France Presse, Reuters, and the rest, who usually send their reporters up to war zones. And so while the comparison with Ukraine is so stark, I mean, I think it was yesterday or the day before, there was a fantastic package by the BBC reporter right from the front lines in Ukraine. And you know that he is reporting to the best of his ability on what he is seeing, what he is hearing. You can rely on it. I mean, they can make mistakes. Anyone makes mistakes. I was a BBC reporter. I made mistakes. I know that. But, I did my best. And that's what you need. You need even one plane of flown into Mekelle with a group of independent journalists in and a camera crew, and they will begin to unpick what is going on. But there's nothing like that either in the document or what we've seen in so far today. I mean, maybe it'll happen tomorrow, but I haven't seen it.
Well, another pain point too, you talk about the journalists, but in terms of Article 10 talks about transitional measures, and Point 3 in Article 10 says the government of Ethiopia will implement a comprehensive national transitional justice policy aimed at accountability, asserting the truth, a redress for victims, reconciliation, and healing. And I can't help but point out, number one, the Ethiopian government was a party to the war. The Ethiopian government is accused of committing genocide. How will the Ethiopian government investigate itself? That makes no sense. There's no mention. The ask from certainly Tigrayans in the diaspora was always independent investigations. And here, this feels like a really big loss. And it seems like it's an effort to cover up the crimes that this government is accused of. What did you make of that? And do you agree that this is a big blow to the people and the victims in Tigray?
Well, I'm afraid I think justice has flown out of the window. I don't think they're going to get any. I don't think it will happen. The UN has, of course, its own system for trying to find it out. But I mean, last time they tried to visit Tigray, they were blocked. Or I think they were given 24 hours in Mekelle, I think was all that was on offer. They weren't allowed to go and visit the victims. They weren't allowed to take statements. I mean, I just think that that's not going to happen. But I mean, there's for me, the fundamental problems with this are twofold. One is is that this is an agreement with the TPLF, and as we've discussed how that problem is. The other one is the disarmament issue. Now, the Tigrayan leadership had made it absolutely crystal clear that they believed that they could not rely on the national army of Ethiopia for their security. They said, these people have been killing us and murdering us. We cannot rely on them for their security. That's exactly what this document allows. And they're supposed to give up their heavy weapons immediately. And I think within 10 days, supposed to have a plan to get rid of all the light weapons. Well, I mean, that puts the people of Tigray at the absolute mercy of the people who have just been murdering them.
That's right. And if you recall, when the president of the president of Addis Ababa, when she was in Mekelle, she visited one of the safe houses and she brought federal soldiers with her, and the women were screaming because these men in uniform are the ones who had gang raped them. And so the idea that now these federal soldiers will be the ones who are put in charge of their protection is a really scary, scary proposition. Is there anything positive that came out of this agreement? Is there anything that gives you like a glimmer of hope, or it's clear what the issues are, and there are more issues, I think, than there are things to be happy about. But is there anything in it that made you go, okay, this is a good first step?
I go back to the situation on the ground. The TDF has not collapsed. It still is in a position to maintain itself and to maintain its position. And that has been, frankly, everything on the negotiating table is always a reflection of what you actually have achieved on the ground. And the strength of the Tigrayan military hasn't been broken. And they are, whatever is said in this document, we'll have to see how they react to events as they unfold. Secondly, as I said earlier, these kind of agreements always need a few days to bed in. Perhaps we're being too soon in our judgment. Let's give it a week. See if the aid does begin to flow, and if the power does come back on, and salaries begin to be paid, and all the other things that people have been desperate for, and particularly that the food and the medicines begin to get through. Even these things would give people a sense that there's something to hope for. So those are potentially positive. The fact that the African Union and the outside powers promise to remain engaged with the process is important. And the pressure on the Ethiopian government has not ended. All of these things are relatively positive, but the bits of paper that have emerged are not positive, in my view. I mean, I say this with all humility. And also the fact that there has been no systematic attempt to brief the people of Tigray, that I find really strange. And I just don't know how to interpret it. I mean, because in the past, the president has actually apologized for failing to keep people informed. He accepted that this had been a mistake, and he said this won't happen again. Well, here's this critical moment, and it doesn't look as if it's happening. And I think that is a pity, to say the least. And how people react to it, not so much in the diaspora. The diaspora, of course, are in a terrible position because their hearts bleed and they don't know what's happening back home. But on the ground, how is that seen? I just don't know. And I think it's. I don't know what to say. It's
troubling. It's really troubling. It's very troubling because we have yet even to have a press release or a statement come out from any of the negotiators who were there, from the Tigray External Affairs Office, from the president, from anyone. And yet we've heard from Ambassador Redwan. We've heard from even Abiy Ahmed actually posted a statement. Now, there's a lot you could read into what he posted, and it was a lot of thanking the African Union for peace. None of them mentioned Tigray, not once, in what they post, but they've both said something. Meanwhile, Tigrayans are sort of staring into an abyss, waiting for a response, still don't have aid, still don't have a restoration of services. And some of that requires some infrastructure work, but a lot of it doesn't. They could turn on phones, they could turn on some of these services if the Ethiopian government was sincere. You're right about the economic pressure in Ethiopia and how they need a result. So I think they're trying to create an image that will then allow them to refinance and restructure some of the debts that they have in order to survive another day, because they really are just hanging on. I hope the international community is smarter than that and is really looking at, what are the outcomes? What has happened? Because as I see it, the way the agreement is written is very frustrating. And in less than 24 hours, Ethiopia has breached its agreement and bombed 3 towns today. The images are of women and children who were hit in these airstrikes, and who's holding Ethiopia accountable? This is what's really frustrating Tigrayans everywhere. Well, I'm going to give you the last word, Martin. Anything that you want to say about this agreement. Hopefully we'll hear from the Tigrayan leadership soon, but in the meantime, we're left to sort of figure out, decipher what all of this means.
Well, I can only wish people courage, and I hope the one thing I hope that has come out of this terrible war is that the international community has finally seen through President Isaias, because, you know, at the end of the day, I think that the behind everything that has happened is his hand. I mean, it may seem bizarre that the leader of an impoverished, tiny state can have such power, but, you know, his ability to plot and strategize is immense. And I hope that people will now understand that. And I mean, some of the statements by the United States consul, I think his name's Walker, from the